Hello, everyone, and welcome to Meaningful Conversations with Talk Cause. Today, we have the absolute honor of hosting the brilliant Dr. Danau Tanu. Danau is an author of Growing Up in Transit, and she's also a leading voice in the world of global mobility, third culture kids, and international education. She's also the co-founder of TCKs of Asia, which is a vibrant platform connecting third culture kids across the continent. Her journey is as fascinating as her work. Growing up speaking Indonesian, Japanese, and Mandarin at home while navigating English in school. Her research dives deep into complexities of identity, belonging, and migration. And today we'll be unpacking the transformative impact of identity and the belonging. But that's not all. She'll share some personal stories, including the powerful meaning behind her name, as we explore how to find a sense of belonging in a transient world. This conversation is one you don't want to miss. So let's dive in. Thank you, Danau. Welcome to Meaningful Conversations with Talk Cause. Thank you so much for joining us today. How do you feel today?
Hi, thanks for having me here. I'm feeling good. A bit sleep deprived, but good. And how are you?
I feel very well, and I'm excited to have this meaningful conversation with you. So thanks for asking.
Same here. Looking forward to this.
Where are you right now, Danau?
At the moment in Canada, and it's 7 a.m. here. And it's cold and rainy all the time.
A few days ago, you were in Japan, weren't you?
Yeah, so I usually live in Tokyo, and I'm here with my parents for Christmas. Yeah, Tokyo weather is the same. More sunny though. And yeah. And where are you?
I'm in India, in the north of India. Well, Danau, you keep traveling. So I would like to know, and our listeners would also like to know, what do you do?
I'm an anthropologist, so a researcher. I like to tell people I'm like Indiana Jones because anthropology is, I think archaeology is part of anthropology in certain countries. Yeah, but I study like people who are still alive, not dead. The ones who study dead people are archaeology, and the ones who study people who are alive are anthropology. So a bit like sociologists, but I shouldn't say anymore. I'll say something offensive probably to the other disciplines. But what I'm trying to say is I love anthropology. It's a study of culture and human behavior. And my main research topic is migration, I suppose, youth and migration, specifically people who grew up moving around a lot. And I think a lot of researchers are, I jokingly say narcissistic because a lot of our research is driven by something that we're personally connected to. And I grew up moving around as well. So I study migration, youth, identity, and so on.
So in short, you study people and how people function in different culture and their identity.
Yeah, basically. Especially the impact of growing up in different cultures when you're growing, when you're a child, because it has a somewhat different impact than if you're an adult going to another country out of your own volition, out of your own choice.
That sounds very interesting. What got you into this?
So, like I said, personal connection. You asked me where am I living and where am I right now and so on. So my background is complicated. Your background's complicated too. So similar. Mm-hmm. My mom's Japanese. My dad's Indonesian of Chinese background. And they met in Singapore, married in Canada, and then moved to Indonesia when I was 3.5. So I was born in Canada and We moved to Indonesia when I was 3.5, and I grew up mostly in Indonesia, but I went to an international school, which sort of is like a completely different world to the local environment. And then 5th grade, I went to Japan for a year with the family, and then back to Indonesia, and then Singapore when I was around 16 or so to finish off high school, and then university in Canada. And I just kind of moved around, and there's a period of my life when over 11 years, I moved, I think, 10 times between, I think, 4 countries. I can't remember. Yeah. So by the end of that, I was exhausted. And because of that mixed background of growing up in different places, also being half, like, parents of different cultures, we grew up speaking, my sister and I grew up speaking 4 different languages, 3 at home and then English at school. And so I really, really struggled with identity for a very long time. So I wanted to one day do a PhD, and I wanted to do it in something about education because I'm an arts graduate. And when I graduated from the arts, I was like, oh my gosh, how do you look for a job? So that's when I was going to do a PhD. I asked my dad, what should I do it on? He said, do it on education. Parents will pay a lot of money for their kids' education. And so I wanted to do it on education, but struggled to find a topic until one day somebody asked me, what makes you angry? And I said, the question, where do you come from? And the thing is, it's not the question that annoys me. It's the fact that when people ask you, a lot of people don't actually want to know where you're from. They just want your answer to match up with wherever they think you're from based on how you look or how you sound, like your accent and so on, right? Anyway, this person said, why don't you do it on that? And I'm like, is that how you decide on a PhD topic? It feels a bit flippant. And she's like, well, if you're angry about it, you'll have that drive inside to continue for the 5 years or however long you need to finish a PhD. Because a lot of people, it's not that they fail the PhD, it's just that they can't, after 2 years or something, they get so sick of their topic, they quit, right? Or life happens and so on. Yeah, so that's how I got into the topic, and it was very self-therapeutic. So it took a total of 5 years to do it. So I decided not to do it on this group of people who are often called third culture kids. Okay, not third country kids, but third culture kids. And basically kids who grow up moving around or grow up outside their parents' culture. That's sort of the traditional definition of that. And in particular, because I thought, anthropology, the method of study is we traditionally in the past, during the colonial era, it was like you go to this unknown village somewhere and then you live and you try to live like the locals and so on. And that's how you collect data, by living among them. And so I thought, where can I find a village of kids who are moving around, growing up outside their parents' culture? And I thought, why don't I do it in an international school? I thought it's either the UN or international school, something from somewhere in the UN. I'm like, I can't get in there. And then they're all adults as well. So I decided to do it at an international school because international schools have a lot of people who grew up moving around. And a lot had been written about international schools, but a lot of it was from the perspective of white, Western, third culture kids, white Western kids who grew up moving around. So basically expat kids. And my experience as an Asian, somebody who looks Asian, also at home, I don't speak English. My experience was very different from the experiences of my schoolmates from the US or Canada and so on, even though I sound like this now. And there were a lot of things growing up that I didn't quite understand, why all the other kids' mothers knew how to make brownies and my mom didn't. She knew how to make sushi rolls, and it was just like stuff that was weird. But the experience was different because all the teachers are mostly white, and so everybody in authority is white, right? And then you look at the textbooks and it's all about American history, Western history, and so on. And so I grew up learning all of that. So I'm living in Indonesia, and you got like math textbooks, even math textbooks, you learn about the nickel and the penny and the quarter. And I didn't learn anything about rupiah, which is the currency of the country I was in. And so those kinds of things are really weird. You don't understand it when you're a kid, but it has an impact on you where you kind of internalize these things that you're absorbing, where you don't see anybody who look like you, who sound like you, represented in these books. And so I grew up feeling as though I was inferior as an Asian, wanting to be white, wanting to have taller, pointier noses, and so on like that. Yeah.
Well, in a way, I'm glad that I did not ask you this question, that where are you from? Because that question also have triggered me since I was a kid, because I started telling people where I'm from depending on what they want to hear. Being a cross-cultural kid myself, that question triggered me. So having lived in different cultures and in between cultures, then now I would like to ask you, where do you feel you're from and where do you think you're from?
Oh, you've asked me this question before, and I can't remember what I said then. And actually, I still don't know what to say. In my case, I think it's hard because I've got my mom, my dad, and my dad's Chinese, but he's like Indonesian. He was born and raised in Indonesia. And I would say I think my love is for Indonesia. When things happen, I have this strong feeling of wanting to defend Indonesia because it's the place where I grew up, and there's a sense of like gotta defend in terms of geopolitical status of the country. I think so. I struggled with identity and I struggled with internalized racism towards the West a lot. And I can go a bit more into that because a lot of the kids who I studied struggled with that as well. But in my case, there's also the relationship between Japan and Indonesia. Growing up, I learned very quickly, like very young, I learned that Indonesia's status in the world is very low, even compared to Japan. And so when I'd meet a Japanese, I learned to first use English to make sure that they know I can speak English. And then once I've established that, then I'll switch to Japanese for them. Because if I start off saying I'm half Indonesian, half Japanese, immediately, especially back then, this is like the 80s and 90s, often they would look down on me as an Indonesian. And so, yeah, I do that. Like, I think you can relate to this as well. A lot of people can relate to this when they're mixed, where they would use the more powerful language or whatever it is to prevent people from looking down on you. Yeah, so I did that a lot with Japan. And then after I finished my PhD, my research, and the book was already published and so on, I like the healing process. I said it was self-therapeutic. So the first year of my PhD, I cried a lot reading about identity and so on. But this healing process just kind of went on even after the PhD. And one of it was about the relationship between Japan and Indonesia, where even though I would use English to establish a status and make sure people don't look down on me, I always identified more with Indonesia than Japan. So if people ask me, where are you from? When I was younger, I would try to say Canada or something based on my nationality. And it would turn out that that's not what they wanted to hear because I'm not white. And then as an adult, I learned to just say my mom's Japanese, my dad's Indonesian. But sometimes I would say I'm Canadian or I'm Chinese or I'm Indonesian. But I would never say I'm Japanese. And the reason for that was because growing up, I felt like Japan rejected the Indonesian side of me, but Indonesia didn't reject the Japanese side of me. And it was just a lot easier to identify as Indonesian. But a few years ago, I went through this process of healing from that. I was at a conference and I heard this story about so the presenter was saying one time, she works with international school kids and she was in, I think, South Africa, speaking with a classroom full of kids whose English was their second language. And she told everyone to write a poem in whatever language they wanted. And And so they did, and they're like whatever language. And she's like, yep, and you can mix it up, use 2 languages, 3 languages, it doesn't matter. Whatever language, like, really? Doesn't have to be English? She's like, yep, doesn't have to be English, even though this was an English-speaking school. And so they finished writing the poems, and people started coming up to read the poems. Some would read it in English, some wrote it in Italian, some in Spanish and Japanese, or whatever. So they kept reading all these different poems in different languages. And then finally, at the end, one girl raises her hand and she's like, I want to read my poem too. And she's Polish, and she's the only Polish girl in the whole school. And so she comes up to the front and she reads her poem, and the poem is in Polish. And she finishes reading it, and nobody in the room understood a single word she said. Right. But when she finished, everyone just kind of applauded for her. And she said that in that moment, she felt so celebrated and accepted because of that. And when I heard this story, I started crying, and I felt like it had something to do with Japan, but I didn't know what. And it took me another 2 years before I realized that it was because of this thing that I had against Japan, I guess, in a way, where I couldn't identify as Japan. I refused and I rejected the Japanese identity because I felt they didn't accept me. And so I went through this process of having to verbally say, I forgive Japan. And it was weird, forgiving a country, but that's sort of what I had to do to process that. And I forgive Japan for looking down on Indonesia, for looking down on me for being Indonesian, for looking down on my dad, and so on. Yeah, that was part of the healing process from identity, because identity it's not just about different culture, right? It's about the power relations between the different culture.
That's an interesting story, that Polish girl reciting a poem in Polish. And I think language also form some aspects of identity. You growing up in between different cultures, you have learned so many languages, and you mentioned something called powerful language. Can you share a bit of story that how learning a powerful language in an international school impacted or influenced you and your identity at home?
Yeah, one of my favorite topics, actually. So I think a lot of kids, even the ones who I studied, I was researching, a lot of, and including myself, we grow up, I think from very young, we can notice which one is the powerful language. And I believe some have said, even from the age of 2 or so on, you kind of notice which one is a powerful language. And kids tend to gravitate towards the powerful language. So a lot of studies of immigrant kids, for example, to the US or Canada or Australia, English-speaking languages, or even immigrant kids to Japan or wherever it is, right? You gravitate towards the dominant language in that context. And a lot of kids then start to refuse using the home language, right? Especially if the country you're growing up in is seen as globally economically more powerful than the country where your parents are from. And so there's a lot of immigrant kids and even international school kids where initially the parents want their kids to learn English, and then the kids hit teenage years and the parents start to realize the kids are refusing to speak the home language or can't speak the home language because they haven't been trained in it. And then the parents panic. So that happens a lot. And in that case, the parents are also gravitating to the more powerful language. And in my case, even from young, I tried very hard not to use the more powerful language than other people in some ways, but I knew that in my heart, because of the internalized racism, I would feel it, right? So, for example, if I meet somebody who doesn't speak English or speaks English with not a Western accent, not like a US accent or so on, I can feel in my heart that I'm feeling that I'm better than them, but I didn't like how I felt. So outwardly, I would try to compensate for that and be very nice to that person, but I knew what was in my heart. And that's called internalized racism. And the way it manifested at home was that one day I remember I think I was around 14, 15, something like that. And I was having an argument with my mom. I don't remember what the argument was about, but I had a hard time trying to explain to her my side of the story in Japanese because it wasn't my first language. I'm fluent in Japanese, but it's not my first language or my strongest language. And so there was a real frustration with my language ability, which is, is genuine. But there was also this sense that I was angry with my mom. So I used English to kind of talk back to her as well. And I spoke in English, like really fast English. And I knew that she wouldn't understand what I was saying. And there was a bit of a like, take that kind of attitude as I said that. But my mom is like very against the sense of like looking down on people. And so she got so angry at me. And she's like, oh, is that what English is that what the school is doing to you? You know, teaching you how to be arrogant with your English. Well, if that's the case, then you can quit school tomorrow. And I laughed. I thought she was joking. And she was like, oh, you think I'm joking? Go get your textbooks. And so I reluctantly went and got my textbooks. And then she threw it in the garbage can. And it was like an old plastic flimsy garbage can. So it broke. And then I laughed when it broke, and it made her even angrier. And so she got one of those plastic, what do you call it? Not rope, but whatever thing. And she tied it up, and she's like, I'll let the garbage man take it tomorrow. And then finally I was like crying, and I realized she was serious. But that was a really important lesson for me in terms of keeping that arrogance in check. But that internal feeling, it didn't really resolve or melt away until I did my PhD and spent those 5 years kind of processing my identity issues and internalized racism and so on.
I like your perspective that you have stated how anger was your driving force to do PhD and how the whole process of PhD was a healing process for you. During your research, you also wrote a book called Growing Up in Transit. And that book, I believe, has resonated with so many people who have felt in between cultures, including me. So I would like to know what inspired you to write it and what were some of the biggest lessons you have learned through your research.
So the inspiration is the same as what I shared earlier, actually, the identity issues and just feeling like, the international schools, they always say they're international, but it's not really. It's very westernized, Eurocentric internationalism, where it's almost like if you don't speak English, you're not international. And so in the school where I collected data, the teachers tended to see the groups, the student groupings, the cliques and so on, based on nationalities. But it wasn't really a nationality grouping. It was more like a language grouping. So the teachers would see the English-speaking kids as international, in quotes, right? And then the teachers would kind of be quite critical of, like the big groups were the Korean-speaking kids, and the Indonesian-speaking kids, and then the Japanese-speaking kids. And there were others as well. And it's not like these other groups didn't speak English. It's just that they would mix. For example, the Indonesian group especially, they were very much a bilingual English and Indonesian group. But from the teacher's perspective, because they were not speaking all English, they looked like it was an Indonesian group. So 2 things there. In the English-speaking group, you can have kids who speak nothing but English, but they're seen as international. In the other groups, they're all at least bilingual, right? They speak their own language, or, in the Indonesian case, Indonesian in English, or Korean in English, Japanese in English. And a lot of them, because their parents are not from Indonesia. So this was a school in Indonesia, an international school in Indonesia. And, so they would also speak Indonesian. So it would be like Korean, English, and Indonesian. They're trilingual. But somehow they were not seen as international because during recess breaks, they would be speaking another language, not English. And I was like, how does the American kid who speaks nothing but English be seen as international? And all these kids who are like trilingual, quadrilingual, whatever, are not seen as international. And I'm like, there's something wrong with our definition of international. And so that's sort of what the book really critiques, that Eurocentric idea of internationalism and how that impacts the children's identity, and also how it creates a lot of internalized racism and how it actually contributes to a lack of integration within the student body. A lot of the kids in the non-English speaking groups actually do want to join the English speaking groups, but they feel as though they are like not quite accepted because their English either is not as good enough, or they speak with a different accent, or culturally they feel like the language itself is not enough. They feel as though they have to act American to be accepted in that group. And they're like, but we're not American. It's supposed to be an international school. So that's one thing. And then when I first arrived at the school, because I heard the teachers teachers say, the Indonesian kids are not international, blah, blah, blah. Why do the Indonesian kids always want to hang out with other Indonesian kids? So in the beginning of the research, I actually went to all these different hangout areas, and I went to the Indonesian group, and I asked them, so I hear from the teachers that like, you guys only hang out with other Indonesians. Like, why is that so? Because in the beginning, I totally believed the teachers, because they're all nice people, right? We're not talking about like Jim Crow American racism kind of thing. These are all nice people with good intentions, right? So I'm not questioning their intentions. They really genuinely want to be international. Well, most of them, but they just don't get it because they grew up in the US or whatever, and they don't understand how to interact cross-culturally. And so anyway, I go to the Indonesian group and I asked this question: why are you guys always hanging out with only with each other and not like hanging out with people of other cultures? And they just look at me like, these are teenagers, 16, 17, like, what are you talking about? Like, I'm not Indonesian, one kid says. I'm Filipino. And then another kid's like, yeah, and I'm Japanese. And then another one's like, yeah, and my dad's Thai and my mom's Indonesian. Or I'm British and dad's British and mom's Indonesian. So it was like a very mixed group. They're not all Indonesian. But because they like hanging out in this group, they all learned to be bilingual. And some of them are, I claim that they can, Indonesian is like 70% good, but not entirely. Some are 50%. And then you had kids who like didn't speak any Indonesian at all because they had just moved to Indonesia, but they liked hanging out in this group. But because they were all Asian and they were all speaking, or, some of them half Asian, and they were all throwing in Indonesian into their speech, the teachers assume they were all Indonesian. And so it's almost like being international is also racialized. There's a race aspect to how the teachers thought international should look like, if that makes sense.
Oh, that's a very in-depth research. And I have seen the similar pattern in my country as well. Mm-hmm. International schools is only about global north, or is only about English. So having done research in this area, in your opinion, how do you think international schools or schools in general should shape the identity and sense of belonging, especially for third culture kids or cross-cultural kids?
Yeah. By the way, I haven't explained what third culture kids mean, have I? In case those listening are wondering, third culture kids, like the third culture comes from this idea that when you go into another culture, you've got your parents' culture, that's the first culture, I think. And then the local culture where you're living presently is the host culture. And third culture kind of just means in between. The interstitial culture, the in-between culture that you develop. And it's not culture 1 plus culture 2 divided by 2. That's not third culture. It's the in-between experience, right? So there's no fourth culture or fifth culture kids. It's just third culture because, after that, it's all in between anyway. And so, working with third culture kids, especially international schools, I get invited to schools to talk about this, about unconscious bias and what we call structural racism. So it's not racism where it's like, oh, go back to where you come from, you blah, 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 and, some racist slur and stuff. That's not the kind of racism we're talking about. Structural racism is where you don't intend to be racist. So you got good intentions. You want to nurture internationalism. But because of our biases that come from our upbringing and so on, we don't notice how we're supporting the racist structure, right? So it's sort of built into the institution. And, whether or not we like it, we end up perpetuating it. And part of that reason is that international schools, often they cite like the first international schools as being the Yokohama International School and the Geneva International School of Geneva. And I think they were both founded in 1924. And so a lot of international schools like, this is when the first international school was founded, blah, 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 and kind of mythologize it. Right. So every culture has their founding myths. And the international school, the founding myth is that 1924 first international school sort of thing. But if you think about 1924, what was the world like? If you think about it, 1924, it was still in the middle of colonialism, right? Europe had colonized most of the globe. And 1924 was still like that. And so what was internationalism like in 1924? It was basically Europeans saying that it was international. And all these schools had only Europeans and I guess some folks from the settler countries, I don't know, mostly, right? And so if we have that foundation and we mythologize it and we raise it as this like great example of how our institutions started without being critical of what the situation was like that, we end up perpetuating the system that was built in 1924. And so what that means is a lot of international schools use textbooks and curriculum that was designed for countries like America, the UK, Australia, and so on. And this is why, as I said before, like a lot of the textbook only has these Western examples, and the history is European history, Western history, and we don't learn much about the local history or global history and I don't remember learning about colonialism in school. It was just like in passing. Oh yeah, there was colonialism. Okay, let's skip over to, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so we need to interrogate our founding myths, because you can try to change things a little here, a little there, all you want, but if you don't change the core, how it was founded, we will end up perpetuating the system. And so changing the curriculum, starting to hire teachers who are diverse instead of mostly white teachers, because a lot of international schools, the requirement is that the teachers need to be from the global north. There's like passport privilege in a lot of the hot recruitment methods. And like I could go on, but recruitment, curriculum, also language. Quite often students are penalized if they don't speak in English and they speak another language. But nowadays, a lot of research has said that's actually not conducive to learning a new language. And new methods of teaching include translanguaging, where you allow the child to continue developing their own language while they learn English, because that will actually help them learn English faster or learn a second language faster. And a lot of kids that I interviewed said the teacher, on their first day of class, the teacher changed their names without asking them if it was okay to change their names. So, Korean kids with a Korean name, they'd go to school and suddenly the teacher's like, Daejeon, it's too hard to pronounce. Let's just call you DJ. Or it'll be like Daniel or whatever. And the kid's like 5 or 6, 7, don't know how to say. So they just go along with it. And I heard one kid, her name, so I use pseudonyms, but let's say her name was Vandana. And so she goes to school, and on the first day, the teacher's like, Vandana. And she says, I was 6, and it was like a complete identity change. I was Vandana the day before, and now I'm Vandana. And she didn't say anything. She said, because she's 6, right? She just goes along with it. And she's like, that's the basis of my identity crisis. Yeah, there's a lot of stories like that.
Well, I think I also see a lot of international schools shifting towards 2 or 3 languages, just not sticking to English, which is a good move, I guess. So Danau, you talked about internalized racism, structured racism, and you also gave an example of something called racial segregation. So can you give a little insight briefly that what is internalized racism?
Yeah, internalized racism is when, I guess, you internalize the values that the world has attached to different races or different cultures, different languages. And so regular racism is like when somebody else is racist towards you, and then maybe they don't like Asians or whatever, right? But internalized racism is when you're racist towards yourself. So as an Asian growing up, I felt inferior because I was Asian. And so you kind of internalize those systems. And then not just that I felt inferior for being Asian, but then I would also look down on others who didn't speak English as well as I do, right? That kind of, so you're racist towards your own people as well. And yeah, so that's internalized racism.
Okay. And now you talked about how schools tend to change people's names. So your name is also quite unique. So what's your name story?
So my name is actually not a name. It's an Indonesian word. It means lake. And my name is like overseas, people can't pronounce it because they've never heard it. And then in Indonesia, they also go, huh? Is it Dana? Danu? And I'm like, no, Dana. I'm like, huh? And I'm like, the lake. Because it's just, if you look at an Indonesian map, it'll say Danau Toba, Danau this, Danau that, meaning Lake Toba, Lake this, Lake that. And I was named that because I was born in Toronto, Canada, near where the 5 Great Lakes are. And we've got Great Lake Ontario in Toronto. And so my dad made a list of a lot of different Indonesian names. Some of them very common, like Kartika, Kartini, and so on and so forth. And my mom, who didn't speak any Indonesian at the time, was like listening to the list and she didn't like them. And then she got to Danau and she's like, what does that mean? And my dad says, oh, it means lake. And she's like, oh, that's nice because it sounds a bit like in English, it's called the Danube River, but in Japanese, it's called Donaugawa. And so she liked this image of the water. And so she picked that without knowing that it's a word. And one time my sister's friend was like, what's your older sister's name? So this is my younger sister's friend. And my sister's like, Danau. And she's like, oh, you're so mean. Like, what's her real name? And she's like, Danau. She's like, oh my gosh, you're so mean and so rude. Like, what's her real name? And I had to step in and say, no, that's actually my real name. She was so embarrassed. But yeah, that's how uncommon it is as a name.
All right.
But I also have, I actually have 4 names, like in all the different languages. Got a Chinese name, what else? A Japanese name, and an English, like a baptism name. But I never use the other ones.
Which name do you identify the most?
Obviously Danau. If you called me by my other names, I wouldn't turn around. Like I wouldn't register. Yeah. So can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Oh, which part of the book resonated with you?
The story that you talked about, that you had a different identity in school, and growing up at home, you had a different identity at home. So it's like Spider-Man, right? So that resonated with me because growing up in a cross-cultural environment, as you know, India, I think we all are TCKs here, or cross-cultural kids here. So yeah, I think I resonated with that. For example, my name, I never identified with my name. People call me Melky, Melkai. People call me with my last name, but no one called me with my first name. And I could never identify with that name because I was not accustomed to anyone calling me with that name. And people call me with different names and I was okay with that. So whenever someone asks me what's my name, I start telling them based on who they are, not who I am. So that's how I grew up. And that's how I resonated with your book, growing up in transit or growing up with different identities. So long story short, I moved to Colombia when I grew up. As soon as I got in, the immigration officer stamped my passport and he said, Bienvenido a Colombia, Sadek. And I literally had goosebumps because that was the first time someone pronounced my name without even, asking me what's the pronunciation of that name. And I was like, oh, this is where I belong. So, that was the first time I felt a sense of identification with my name. And now I don't shy away if someone asks me what's my name. So that's my story of identification. That's how I resonated with your book. But I would like to know from you, Danau, that growing up in transit and you have lived in between culture and you're still transiting from one country to another country, doing your research, what is sense of identity for you? And as you have grown up as a third culture kid, what is your identity and how do you identify yourself? What is identity for you?
Yeah. So before we go on, I just want to say, I think for the audience that you grew up with the name Melchizedek Samuel in India. This is why it was hard for people to get your name, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that was a very cool story cool story too. So how do I identify? I think, so I encountered the term third culture kids when I was doing my PhD. And initially when I read the book, I was like, oh, this is mostly about the white kids that I went to school with. It's not about me. So I didn't really, I resonated with a lot of the themes in the book. Because it talks about when you move around a lot, you always feel restless. Like there's this body clock that, every 2-3 years makes you want to move, or rootlessness, not knowing where you belong and stuff like that. So I could relate to a lot of it, but it was still like, oh, this is not about, like, when I'm reading all the examples in the book, it's not about me. And it's on in the third edition. I read the first edition, so the third edition is a lot more diverse. But at some point, I read also about unresolved grief that you experience through moving around. And that hit me like a ton of bricks. And I basically cried for 2 hours after reading that. And because it resonated with me, my experience having moved to Japan and not really understanding the culture and stuff and feeling isolated. And so unresolved grief is like this grief that you feel when, like, a loss of something, but you never actually grieve it, right? So you move to a different place and you never actually grieve the loss of identity, belonging, and so on. And so then I was totally sold on this idea of third culture kids, and I identified as a TCK, as we call it, for a while. And then I got over all my identity issues, and now I really don't care anymore. I still talk about it a lot because it's part of my research, and I work in this field. But for myself, now when people ask me where I'm from, I just tell them what they want to hear. Like you said before, you answer based on who they are, not who you feel you are, or something like that. You said something like that. And I used to care, like when people ask me where I'm from, and I'd want to tell them where I feel I'm from. And then I always got frustrated when they didn't seem to care. Now I just give them what they want. And I'll say, my mom's Japanese, my dad's Indonesian, or, I'll say my dad's Indonesian Chinese, either way, depending on the situation. And they're mostly satisfied with that. And so I'm like, okay. I think in the past, when I say that, I felt like it didn't really represent the whole of who I am. And so I'd want to say something else, or like, identify as TCK. But now I'm like, yeah, whatever. I don't really care because I know who I am. And I guess I've accepted that I'm mixed, and it's okay to be mixed. It's okay to be multicultural. That's an identity in and of itself, being in between. And I think this is why we get along, or like when we first met, resonates. Yeah, I'm sure you felt it when we met at that conference where there were a lot of people feeling like this. There's a sense of like, we get each other and we don't have to explain it to each other, and we can be from any mix of countries, right? So you and I don't really share a background other than like we're both Asian and speak English, but somehow that in-betweenness, we share that in-betweenness, and that's, there's a sense of connection there.
There's a sense of connection, there's a sense of belonging, and there's a sense of identity in that. So yeah, definitely. You talked about conference, and you attend these kind of conference, but you yourself is conducting some kind of webinar on TCK and cross-culture kids in Global South. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So as I said, a lot of the research has been done on kids from the global north, in particular English-speaking countries. And then it started with America, and then it was about kids from English-speaking countries. And then there was a bit of research on European kids as well. And then my book was the first one looking in depth into non-white kids who have these experiences. But it's still international school, very privileged group of kids. And not much has been done. And I wouldn't say not much has been done on Global South kids. Like, I think the Global South, because of colonialism, like the whole nations have experienced this sense of feeling in between, caught in between. And, a lot of people have experienced that without having to move. So in a way, it's not new about the Global South, but it's new in the context of the third culture kid research. Not much has been talked about it in that sort of little field of research. And so on January 3rd, 2025, we'll be doing a webinar on third culture kids from the Global South. What is it like to be a third culture kid from post-colonial countries in Asia and Africa? Yes, the focus on, I think, Indonesians, Indians, Nigerians.
Most of my audiences are from Global South, so I will share the link in the description for someone who is interested to join that webinar. Okay, so then now one tip or your suggestion, or maybe your story, that in transient world, finding an anchor can be challenging. And being a TCK or a cross-cultural kid, maybe it's a privilege or maybe it's a challenge. So in your opinion, how can people find anchor during this transition from one culture to another culture, or one country to another country, or one identity to another identity?
I think friends, and it's a lot easier now in 2024 compared to 80s and 90s before the internet. Kind of hard to imagine that those times, but now I've learned to, the practical stuff, you can still connect with your friends via Zoom. But it's not just about hanging out, right? It's about developing meaningful relationships and having meaningful conversations with people. And one of the things that I really learned from my research is the power of listening. It's like I interviewed 140 people or something, and through that process learned that just by listening and being genuinely interested in people's stories, it makes them feel heard. And I've had interviewees like cry during the interview and then thank me for interviewing them. And I'm like, no, I should be thanking you because, you're helping me with research data. Yeah, there's that. Being heard is, I think, can very much make you feel connected and contribute to a sense of belonging as well. So dealing with our own identity issues and then being genuinely interested in others and building that connection, like a deep, meaningful connection, and then carrying it around in your phone or laptop via Zoom and so on. Having friends who will see you through those transitions, I think, is important. Yeah, because in the past, my friendships used to be 2 or 3 years, and now I can maintain it a lot easier, friendships.
I think, yes, I believe deep listening is something which builds connection, which kind of cultivates meaningful conversation. And that's why I always emphasize on meaningful conversation. That's what we are having. And meaningful conversation leads to meaningful connections. So now, before we wrap up, there's a rapid fire round. Quick questions, quick answers, no overthinking. All right. So 5 seconds, 5 questions. Are you ready?
Okay.
So,
never done this, but yeah.
All right. So what's the first word that comes to mind when you think of home?
Family, I guess.
Books or podcasts? What's your go-to for inspiration?
Oh, that's hard, but in terms of TCKs, there's a TCKs of Asia podcast that I'm actually involved in. Yeah, I would go to that if you're looking for TCK stuff.
All right. I will also share the link for TCK for Asia podcast.
Yeah.
One thing you always carry when you travel?
My laptop. That's like connects me to the world. Also book, sorry. The Jakarta Method. It's about massacres, but it looks at history from a global perspective, sort of. Like it connects different events in different places at the same time, that's happening at the same time, which is the type of history teaching that I wish they had done in schools instead of like just focusing on one geographic location and stuff. Sorry, just wanted to add that.
And now, if you could describe your growing up as a third culture kid in one word, what would it be?
Mix.
You prefer tea or coffee for a long writing session?
Coffee, definitely coffee. Strong coffee, dark roast, black.
Yeah, for me that's for sure. Coffee black, no sugar. So Danau, thank you for sharing your profound insights, your stories, and your heart with us today.
Thank you so much for having me here as well. And I love that. Is that the subtitle? Meaningful Conversations, or is that the title? I love that.
That's the title, Meaningful Conversations. Danau, your work continues to inspire those navigating the complexities of identity and belonging. To our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. If today's conversation resonated with you, don't forget to check out Danau's book, Growing Up in Transit, and explore her incredible work on her website. The link I have shared in the description. Until next time, remember, in a world that's constantly shifting, the deepest truths lie in understanding ourselves and others. Keep creating meaningful spaces for connection, wherever you are and whoever you are with. Until then, keep living with intention.